This video presents PyHolmes, a prototype tool that helps Python developers find the root causes of failing tests in both traditional shallow software and deep neural networks. Given a failing unit test, PyHolmes presents to the developer a set of slight alterations to their original failing input, which would change the test result from a failure to a pass. By observing the differences between the original test input and the altered input provided by PyHolmes, a developer can more easily identify what about their input caused the program to fail. In traditional shallow software, this approach could help developers identify faulty code more quickly. In deep neural networks, PyHolmes could help developers identify gaps in their training datasets. PyHolmes can help developers find the root causes of failing tests in shallow programs, such as revealing to a developer that their function fails to handle strings containing apostrophes. In deep learning contexts, it can reveal which dimensions of an input caused a failure. This can provide a developer with valuable clues for what new samples to include in their training dataset. PyHolmes follows the same strategy for deep and shallow software, just with different implementations. The strategy is as follows. First, make small changes to the original failing input in order to find similar inputs that pass. Second, filter for the inputs among these that are processed by the program under test as similarly to the original input as possible. This process finds passing inputs that are similar in both value and behavior to the original. By observing the difference between these inputs and the original, the developer can infer why their original input caused a failure. Depending on whether the program under test is a traditional shallow program or a deep neural network, PyHolmes uses one of two implementations. If the program under test is a traditional shallow program, similar input values are found by applying random fuzzing to the original input. Next, those inputs are filtered for similar behavior by comparing the execution paths they produce with the execution path produced by the original input. If instead the program under test is a deep neural network, similar input values are found by adjusting the original input down the loss gradient with respect to that input. This process is identical to adversarial sample generation, except PyHolmes descends the loss gradient instead of ascending it. Next, those inputs are filtered for similar behavior by comparing the neuron activations they produce in the final embedding layer with those caused by the original input. Now we'll discuss how to use PyHolmes for a deep neural network. First, the user writes a unit test which contains some required variables, such as the original failing input tensor and the valid range of values for the elements of that tensor. All these variables are discussed in depth in our artifacts README. Now, the user calls PyHolmes from the command line. CLI flags for PyHolmes are also discussed in our artifacts README. Now, PyHolmes presents a report like this for each of the three passing and failing inputs that elicited the most similar neuron activation in the final embedding layer. For brevity, this slide shows only one passing input. PyHolmes shows the model's loss on the original failing input, whether this new input provided by PyHolmes passed or failed, the model's loss on this new input, the difference in activation of the final embedding layer between the original input and this one, and the value of the new input tensor. So here's a quick demonstration of how you can use PyHolmes in order to generate variant inputs for a test of a deep neural network. So here the model is randomly weighted and the input is totally arbitrary. That's just so that we can focus on the more meaningful things here of how you actually do this. So the unit test needs to instantiate the model, the optimizer that was once used to train the model, a loss function for evaluating the model's performance, the minimum and maximum values that a given element of the input tensor is allowed to have, an adjustment rate that governs a step size for descending the loss gradient with respect to the input that PyHolmes uses to determine how quickly it's going to alter the original input to create variance. The indices of any elements you'd prefer PyHolmes not touch when it is generating these inputs, and then the original failing input. Then the test needs to pass the input to the model and collect the output, instantiate a label, and finally use an insert function. So now that we've written this, we can point PyHolmes to this method, and it will give us variant inputs. So if we open up the terminal, we can then call python pyholmes.py, tell it it's running in deep learning mode, give it the name of the file that's containing this test, so test dnn0 with handmade input.py, line 11. So now PyHolmes gives us a readout And here's the readout that I described earlier. So we've got the original loss, and then up to 3 passing and up to 3 failing tests. So it is totally possible that we'll get fewer than 3 passing tests, or no passing tests. Similarly, we may get fewer than 3 or no failing tests. And all that is just down to, as PyHolmes was generating variant inputs, how quickly did they change from being failing inputs to passing inputs? Typically, as PyHolmes is generating, the farther and farther it goes down the sort of chain of variant inputs that it's generating, the more and more likely those inputs are to be passing, because there's an accumulation of assistive adjustments to those inputs. So in this case, for example, we got 3 passing tests, but no failing tests. And that happens sometimes. It's determined by the complexity of your problem and by the adjustment rate that you choose. Suppose a user has trained a fully connected neural network on the MNIST database of handwritten digits. This is a multi-class classification task where each input is a grayscale image of a handwritten digit, and an image's label specifies which of the 10 digits it is. The user creates a Jupyter notebook that runs their model on a validation dataset and uses PyHolmes to explain any mistakes. The entirety of this notebook can be found in our artifact as mnist_demo.ipynb. Here is the part of the notebook that calls PyHolmes. Anytime a failing input is discovered, the notebook automatically writes a unit test that PyHolmes can be called on, and then calls PyHolmes to explain the failure. To visualize the output tensors, the notebook parses them from PyHolmes' text output and plots them with matplotlib, along with another image showing the difference between the original and the variant. Let's look at the results for this handwritten 5, which the model originally misclassified as a 3. These difference images reveal the cause of the failure. The user's model over-relies on 5s that overlap with the red areas of the plots. The user can now make their model more versatile by adding to the dataset 5s that look similar to this one, and also avoid densely red areas. Thanks to PyHolmes, a user can rapidly obtain clues about why a test fails, allowing them to debug the issue it uncovered more quickly. So now we've talked about how PyHolmes is used at a basic level, but there are still some roadblocks that might make it difficult to use in practice. For example, if you have a failing test, you have to write a pretty long-winded unit test in order to get PyHolmes working on it. And also, because PyHolmes gives you back the tensors as a raw text dump to the terminal, if you're dealing with if your input is pictorial, like a photo or a drawing, it's very difficult to make sense of. So this Jupyter Notebook is an example of how PyHolmes can be used programmatically, and its text output can be parsed and then visualized in order to use it in a more visual context. So here we're using the MNIST dataset. And what we're doing is we are passing images from the validation set for MNIST to our model that we've already trained. So we're working with an actual model now, not just something randomly weighted. And then for any failing input, we generate automatically one of those unit tests from before, and then we get PyHolmes output, and then we visualize that output. So here's a 5 that the model thought was a 3, and here are some variants that PyHolmes generated of those 5s, along with gradients to show more easily to the eye how they differ. And on these, the model passes. Similarly, here's a 7 that the model misclassified as a 2, and some variant 7s that the model passes on. Again, not every input will see passing variants generated by PyHolmes. So for example, this 7, which PyHolmes thought was a 2, no input that PyHolmes generated under its current settings were correctly classified by the model as a 7. But nonetheless, any new inputs generated by PyHolmes are still going to elicit a lower loss from the model as long as the adjustment rate was small enough to begin with.